Okay, here we go. We're going to begin. Brother Reggie leading us in a prayer.
Father, we're again thankful for this evening, for the sun and the rain we both had today. We're thankful for your word that we can study it. We're thankful for the teachers that have given their time and their talents and desire to teach thy word. And we're thankful for us as students that we can study it, apply it to our lives, and be closer to thee because of it. Again, thank you for all you do. In Christ's name we pray.
Amen. Okay, we're going to pick up our speed just a little bit because we are in chapter 1. That means we're a few chapters behind. So we're over in chapter 1, I think about verse 13. If you're looking at your outline, that's C. Outline letter C. So let's go there. Job loses his property and his children. So what we ended on last time, there was this council in heaven. The sons of God appeared before God, and he was speaking with them, and Satan presented himself to God, and God questioned what he'd been doing. And what had Satan been doing? He'd been doing exactly what Peter says he does. 2 Peter 5, verse 8. Or is that 1 Peter 5? I always get that confused. At any rate, he is like a roaring lion going about seeking whom he may devour. And that's what he had been doing, going to and fro in the earth. Going here, going there. He's looking where he can cause a problem. And so that's when God asked him about his servant Job. Have you considered my servant Job? And that's when Satan said, well, you've built this hedge around him. No wonder he's faithful. So in essence, what he was saying was, he is only serving you because of all these great things you've given him. Look, he's the richest man, most powerful man in the East. He has more riches than anyone else. Well, I would serve you myself if you treated me like you treated Job. That's what I told my dad one time. I went to visit him. He'd been keeping my girls, and I walked in, and they were eating whatever they wanted to. They were jumping up and down on that bed downstairs that no one was allowed to get on when I was growing up. And I said, hey, what's going on here? I said, if you treated me like that, I'd still be living at home. He said, that's why I don't treat you that way. Now go on about your business. So in essence, that's what Satan was saying. So what he was telling God was, you're not worthy of worship. You take those things away, and he will curse you to your face. So that brings us up to verse 13, verses 13 through 22. And what we have here is Job loses his property and his children. They were having a feast day in the oldest brother's home. A messenger brought news about the Sabians descending and stealing the livestock. They killed the servants, and the oxen and the asses were stolen, and those servants were also killed. Now, while he was yet receiving that information, that information was yet being told to him, another servant comes. It said, fire from heaven came down. Now, we don't know what this is, just fire from heaven. Could have been lightning. It could have been that which destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. I don't know what it could have been, but it was fire from heaven, and they killed all the sheep and the shepherds. He didn't have time to even process what he'd just been told. It's just one catastrophe right after the other. What did they use sheep for? What was that a common use? Worship, sacrifice, right? You see what Satan's doing here? He's trying to get in between Job and God. Well, if I can't just destroy him with taking all his things away, I'll prevent him from even being able to worship. I'll make it so that I give him an easy excuse. Well, I'm already destroyed financially. Well, I'll give him an excuse to say, well, I don't even have anything to offer in sacrifice. Well, I already don't feel really well, so I'm just not even going to go to worship today. Well, I have a company coming. I'm just going to stay home. There's 1,000 excuses that we can make. Do you think Job might have come up with an excuse or two to be angry and decide he didn't want to worship God? Well, certainly he could have. Well, while that servant was still speaking, another one came and brought the news of his children. All 10 of them had been killed with a great wind. So we see what Satan does. Satan doesn't give you time to recover. He hits you, he hits you, he hits you. If he can get you down and kick you a little bit while you're trying to get back on your feet, he loves to do that also. If he can get you a little down and depressed, make you feeling a little bad so you can blame God about that also, he wants to overwhelm you, and that's his plan. And so you see, he has what he thinks in his mind is Job on the ropes. But guess what? He did have Job on the ropes. He had him on the ropes. In fact, I think he probably had him down on the mat. And so he's wanting to make him give up and turn against God. That was the greatest loss up to that time in Job's life. It seems like he lost every one of his children. Lost them all. You're not supposed to lose your children, are you? That's not the natural occurrence of events, right? I mean, your children are supposed to bury you. Well, that's not what happened in Job's life. Job rose, he tore his garment, shaved his head, he fell down to the ground, he worshiped God. Well, his arising means he took action. Shaved his head. I don't know, he cut his hair, he pulled his hair out, he did something, but he was showing that he was mourning. He was mourning before God. Job still understood God was a just and a merciful God, and he was bowing down before him. In all of this, what did Job not do? Yeah, he didn't sin. He did not sin. Satan failed in the first attack. That brings us to chapter 2. The second meeting in heaven unfolds for the most part just like it did in chapter 1. Everyone appears before God. Satan comes to have to give an account. God praises Job. Satan accuses Job. Well, you're not worthy of worship. Well, this first thing didn't happen, but Satan never gives up the attack. That's 1 Peter 5, 8 through 9, by the way, not 2 Peter. 1 Peter, okay? This time he claimed that Job would give up all he had to save his life. Well, you took away his money, you took away his children, but if you let me touch him, he will give up his faith. So what Job is saying here and telling God is he didn't really love his children. He didn't really love them. He liked them maybe a little bit. Well, that's not true. That's a lie. Job offered sacrifice on behalf of his children every single morning. And he uses this proverb, skin for skin. What that means is that's a figurative way of saying any outward good that you have is not so dear that you will not exchange it for something else. Okay? You have nothing that is not so dear to you that you wouldn't exchange it for yourself. Okay? You'll swap your children for your own good. You'll swap any possession you have for your own good. You'll swap anything you own for your own good. Skin for skin. That's what Satan was saying here. If you touch his bones and his flesh, he'll willingly give up anything to save himself. That's what Satan is saying here. But through it all, we're going to notice in verses 7 through 10, Job keeps his integrity. So he leaves God's presence, and he smote him with what we know as sore boils. Has anyone here ever had a boil? You ever had a boil? I don't know if I've ever had a boil. I tell you what I did have one time. I had a spider bite above my left knee, and I went to the emergency room, and they lanced it, and in lancing that, I lived in Memphis, they gave me a staph infection in that spider bite. And it swelled up and got big, and it looked like a boil. Of course, it wasn't really a boil, but boy, it was sore and it was infected, and it got worse and worse. And ultimately, they had to do surgery on my leg. But it was I could hardly walk just from the spider bite. The spider bite itself kind of looked like a boil, but I knew it was a spider bite because I'd had one when I was 16. And but I can imagine, and I have empathy and sympathy for Job when I read sore boils. Okay? You can't touch a boil, something that sore. I couldn't wear a pair of pants on my leg. I couldn't. Nothing could touch that. It was so sore. Now imagine, he had them from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. They were so sore. Okay. Now, it was so bad that he was swollen. They changed his appearance. You couldn't even tell if you knew Job. You wouldn't recognize him as Job. He hurt so bad he couldn't eat. He was infested with worms in the boil. It caused him to swell. He was emaciated. It gave him bad breath. He lost weight. He was in pain. It darkened his skin. He had a terrible fever because of the infection. And look, in chapter 7, verse 3, when we get over there, we're going to notice this wasn't a short period. This lasted for months. For months. You can't sit down, you can't lay down, you can't find a position where you're not in terrible, terrible pain. It's awful. His wife suggested Job curse God and die. How should we feel about that? How should we feel about Job's wife? You know, I don't know if she gets a bad rap or not. I feel, I change from time to time about that. But here's the thing. Maybe she thought that it would be better for him to die because, look, she's having to live with Job, watching him suffer all the time. But here's the thing. If you curse God, that means now you're guilty. You die lost. That's not good. She would have surely known that. So I mostly condemn her for that. But listen, Job wasn't the only one that lost 10 children. Job wasn't the only one who lost everything. She also lost everything. She just didn't have the physical ailment Job had, but she's watching her husband. Okay? But there have been a lot of well-meaning, foolish people that have stood over the casket of someone who was not a Christian and said, well, they're at peace now. Look, no, they're not. No, they're not. There is no peace for the lost. So you can't curse God in the situation which Job was. Okay? Job did not listen, obviously, to his wife, and he reminded her, listen, if we're going to receive the good in this life from God, guess what comes in the natural occurrence of life? Difficult times. Difficult times. Listen, that doesn't make those difficult times any better. It just means it's life. It's life, and we still have to worship and be faithful to God. That doesn't mean we appreciate the difficult times. That just means we look into eternity. That's what Job teaches us. It doesn't make us enjoy the difficult times. It doesn't make us appreciate the difficult times other than what the difficult times might be able to teach us. Now, we need to learn from those difficult times, okay? That doesn't mean we enjoy them and appreciate just for the difficult part of it. But we do learn from them. Then guess who shows up? Verses 11 through 13. He's got these 3 friends. Boy, if you got friends like that, you certainly don't need people to come cause you a problem, do you? The purpose of the friends were to visit with Job and to mourn with him. You weep with those who weep and you rejoice with those who rejoice. Well, they weren't mourning with Job. They were just accusing him. That was the way their stated purpose to mourn with him, but ultimately they just added to the problem. If you have problems in your life already, you do not need someone to show up and add difficulty to your life. Look, I've got enough problems. I do not need additional problems, right? I need friends and loved ones who help shoulder the problems and alleviate problems. But it seems that at least in the beginning, these were intimate friends. It were maybe some of his oldest friends. And again, when they showed up to visit with him, this had been going on, chapter 7, verse 3, for months. That means at least 2 months and probably longer. Job was likely sitting outside of his home as they approached, and when they neared, they saw him, but they didn't recognize him. They didn't recognize him because he was so disfigured. Can you imagine how many boils you have to have on your face and your head for someone to look at you, known you for years, and you don't look like that person anymore? You're so swollen and lumpy and disfigured. And when they realized it was him, they raised their voices, they wept, they lamented, they tore their outer clothing, they cast dust on their heads. That was a sign of mourning. And they sat for 7 days. They didn't say a word. That was a common practice. 7 days was kind of the general mourning period. Now, when it says they sat there and they didn't speak, they were silent, well, they spoke. They probably spoke to each other. They spoke to the servants. They did their natural daily routine. They just didn't speak to Job. That was how that worked. That was the custom. They didn't speak to Job. They didn't say, Job, what's going on? Job, what can we do for you? Job, what's happened? They let Job sit in silence. That was the custom. Okay? They were shaken in their confidence about Job himself. Because now we're going to remember, they had the wrong mindset on why Job was going through this. They weren't understanding, okay? So they come and they see Job and they're thinking the wrong way. That brings us to chapter 3. And Job finally speaks. He finally speaks. To open the mouth, that's a common idiom for this type of literature and for the time. So he began to speak, and he broke that 7-day silence. And he begins to describe a curse. Now, he's not cursing God. What he's cursing is, he is cursing what's happening to him. And he goes all the way back to what? The very day he was born. If he had just never been born, right? Because after all, if he'd never been born, he'd never had children. He wouldn't have experienced the loss of those children. If he'd never been born, he wouldn't have experienced the loss of everything he had. If he'd never been born, he wouldn't be experiencing this physical trauma that he's going through in his life. Who can blame him? If he had just never been born, none of this would have ever happened. I don't know that we can blame him. He despised the day when it was announced a man-child was conceived, he said. He just wished it had never happened. And in the next passage, verses 4 through 10, we might say in our vernacular, he doubled down on it. He doubled down. He said, let that day be darkness. Let it be blotted off of the calendar, in other words. Wish it never even been mentioned. Job then begins to bring up some questions. There were some searching questions. Now, he couldn't change his history. Job had been born, okay? He had been conceived, but then he says, why couldn't I have just died? Why couldn't I have just died even before my birth? Why couldn't I have died in the womb or during the process of birth? Why did I live? Why was I received with joy by my parents? You know, a birth is a happy occasion to normal godly people. It is anyway, right? Even people who are not godly people, normal people see birth as a joyous occasion. Brother Jim just mentioned his great-grandson who just came into the world. It's a happy occasion. So why was he received with joy if all these things were going to happen? He uses this phrase, why did the knees prevent me? Why were his mother's knees opened in birth? You know, that happens first. Why did that even happen if I was going to have these things happen to me? You know, the idea is, why was I delicately handled? Why was I nursed to good health and treated kindly? Why were all these things happen to me why did all these things happen to me as a child if I was just going to be treated this way in adulthood? If I had died, all this could have been avoided. Okay? If I were dead, quiet, lying still and being quiet, verses 13 through 16. Sleeping the sleep of death. That's a idiom for obviously being in the grave. He said, none of these things would happen to me. I couldn't be troubled by these things. There the wicked cease from troubling. The forces behind this happening couldn't do these things to me. If I were dead, no one could steal my property. No one could destroy my property. I wouldn't know about what was happening to my children, things like that. And then we see in the following passage, 24 through 26, his worst fears are realized. Literally, he says, for I fear a fear. I fear a fear. I fear what's going on now, but I fear what is coming next is far worse than what I'm experiencing right now. Well, that's true. That's true. What is going to continually come to him, it just gets worse and worse and worse. Today was the best day. Right now was the best time. From this moment on, the next moment is worse. The next day is worse. Tonight is worse. Tomorrow morning is worse. And so that's what he says, I fear the fear. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And then when we get over to chapter 4, any comments or questions? We get over to chapter 4, and Eliphaz, he begins his speech. It says, with soft words. And what he does, he suggests that he just can't hold back. He can't hold back since he believes that Job had offended God in some way. And he wanted to know, Job, if I make some observations, would this offend you? If I make some suggestions to you on what might have happened, what may have transpired to put you in this position, would that offend you? Because after all, I am your good friend. And I'm here to help you. I'm here to mourn with you. He said, I want to tell you a few things, and would it hurt your feelings if it might implicate you in some way? So, he apologized beforehand based on all the things that Job had done for others in similar situations. He says, I want to apologize for what I'm about to tell you because you've been so kind to other people who have suffered like you're suffering in the past. And so he claimed that Job was accusing God of injustice because he cursed the day of his birth. You're saying that God is not a just God because you're hoping that you wish that you had never been born. And what he's doing is he is just pointing to the old principle, you reap what you sow. Is that true? You reap what you sow? Well, we reap what we sow, but was he making the proper application? Oh, he missed it big time when he's applying that to Job, wasn't he? What Eliphaz said when he was making that application of you reap what you sow was absolutely correct. He was correct. But he wasn't looking at the situation properly. Okay? He wasn't looking at the situation properly. You do reap what you sow. But Job was not reaping what he had sown. Okay? Eliphaz spoke of another biblical truth in verses 9 through 11. The wicked are going to be punished by God. They cannot escape. They cannot escape. But again, he misapplied that when he spoke that to Job. Okay? We'll notice that over in Job 13, verses 1 through 5 when we get there. And now here's the thing that really got me about Eliphaz. Eliphaz wants to accuse Job of having great sin in his life. So to be able to back that up, he speaks of this great vision that he had in the night. listen, people are still having these visions today. This soft whisper, this soft voice in the night came to me, and it told me this thing about you, Job, or about a similar situation. Well, Eliphaz is telling Job he's a sinner, and he's lying to Job about having a vision. Now that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? So he talks about this vision he had in verses 12 through 21. Now it happened on a different occasion, but it was about this point under consideration. And the idea here is that people are not as just or righteous as God is. Okay? And like these other statements that Eliphaz made, he is correct in that statement. But he's making an improper application to Job, and in addition to that, he told a lie. He didn't have a vision. He didn't have a faint whisper in the night giving him this information. He is telling a lie and accusing Job of having sin in his life. Well, in chapter 5, he continued his speech. Eliphaz made some pretty rough statements here to Job. And what this tells us is, by the time we get over to the end of the book, this tells us a whole lot about Job's character, because he made sacrifice on the part of Eliphaz. He overlooked all that, didn't he? Because Job is a man of high character. He was a mature man. Brother Jim brought that out. A perfect man, a mature man in his faith of God. But he told Job to call out. He said, no one's going to hear you. Go ahead, call out. No one's going to help you. He told him the foolish take root, meaning that, Job, you're a fool. You were blessed for a while, now it's time to pay. We call that, now it's time to pay the piper, right? Now you're getting what you've got coming. He made this statement: your children are far from safety. Job, they were murdered. You know what that means? He's telling this man who is suffering that, Job, not only are you sinning, but your children got what they deserved. They got what they had coming. They were crushed in the gate. Now, in ancient times, what happened in the gate? What took place in the gate? Judgment, right? That's where the judgment was made. That's where, Yeah, the wise men, the leaders, they made judgment. Legal issues were settled in the gate. That means that your children were judged and found to be guilty of sin. That's why they were killed. Your children were killed because of their sin. He says affliction doesn't come forth from the dust, meaning it isn't from natural causes. Affliction doesn't come from natural causes, Job. God is punishing you. Now listen, is that correct? Has anyone ever been afflicted because of the natural world? Well, we're going to notice here in a little while that there are such things as accidents, sickness, wars. The natural world punishes all people in the same way. It doesn't matter who you are. Bad things happen to good people. And that's what one of the themes that we see in the book of Job. So Eliphaz then, he wanted to offer counsel to Job. Verses 8 through 11. He says, you brought this on yourself through your sinful conduct. Now commit yourself to God. Now, that's a good point. If someone is sinful, repent and commit yourself to God. That is a valid point to someone who is living in opposition to God. But again, his judgment was wrong in making that application to Job. Job was not being sinful. And by saying that Job's affliction was caused by personal sin was way off base. Eliphaz was speaking when he should have been listening. We notice in verses 17 through 27 that God's correction ought to be desired. And again, Eliphaz makes a good point. God loves His children, and does God correct His children? Well, sure, He chastises His children. That's taught all through the Old Testament. It's taught in the New Testament. The writer of Hebrews teaches that. But the issue here is Eliphaz is telling Job, you're being punished because you're a sinner. You're living in sin. And he says, you will gain the blessings and the protection of God if you'll just repent. Excellent points if you're talking to a sinner. If you're talking to someone living in sin. It's an excellent point if you're just teaching biblical principles or godly principles. But he's applying that to Job, who is in affliction, and it's not because he is a sinner. Any comments? Let's notice chapter 6. Job responds to this, and he responds in anguish. Because he's in anguish. He has grief. All right? He asks for his friends to fairly assess his condition. He believes if they had done that they would have seen that his complaints were justified. Is it sinful to complain about a terrible, terrible situation? It's not always sinful to complain about a terrible situation. Now, if a person incessantly complains, and that's all they're known for, listen, all of life is not terrible. Okay, we learn that in the New Testament. Christians are to be happy in that they look forward to and they know, Paul said, in whatever state I am, I have learned therefore to be content. Okay? But this is a situation in which Job has all of a sudden found himself, and he is being bombarded that he is guilty of something. Job's not guilty. So it's okay. And what he's talking about, complaint here, is defending himself. He's defending himself. Okay? That's what Job's talking about. The complaint is, I'm bringing a complaint. I'm bringing a defense against what you're saying. He's not just complaining, oh, well, it's just, how are you today? Oh, it's just a terrible day. I've never had a good day in my life. There's a difference. Okay? There's a difference. That's not what Job's talking about, okay? But if they had assessed the situation, they would see that Job is right in saying, I'm not a sinner. I'm not living in sin. And they weren't appreciating his suffering. They came predisposed to blame Job. They had in their mind, when they heard about all the bad things happened to Job, oh, well, Job's done something. Let's go straighten Job out. See, that's what they came with. But he maintained that he had not been unjust or unreasonable in his affliction. In fact, if he had been measured in the balance, he said, you would find that my defense or my complaints, they would be equal. I'm only defending myself in that what I'm defending myself against. In other words, that's what he's talking about. And he said, if you were to measure my defense against what I am being accused of, and if it were the weight of the sand of the sea, my defense would be equal to that. I'm not overly defending myself, in other words, okay? And Job was describing this. I think this is a great application for us today. Job described his words as too great to even be able to express. His affliction was so great, he did not have the words to express how he felt. Have you ever felt that way? That your situation and your grief was so great, whatever that may be. Everybody's situation is different. And all of our griefs and tribulations don't fall in this category. But some of them do. That they are so great that we cannot properly express them to God. And all we can say, maybe, is, please help me. That's why Paul talked about the Holy Spirit coming to our aid in Romans 8:26. There's the reason that passage is in there. The Holy Spirit mediates on our behalf. Okay? He comes on our behalf and is a go-between between us and God to help explain what we're saying. Job talks about loss of hope. He stated that his complaints were natural. And he illustrated that with the donkey who only complains when there's no food. And then he uses, which I think is a little humorous, the complaint of unseasoned food. Have you ever tried to eat an egg with no salt? Look, I'm not a fan. Okay? A lot of salt and a lot of other stuff. Okay? But I get it. Verses 5 through 7. That's a valid complaint. And I loved it the first time I ever read this in the book of Job. Eggs with no salt. A valid complaint. Okay? And that's when Job requested to die. When sorrows become so accumulated, brethren, people have those natural feelings. They become overwhelmed with pain. Now listen, that's not evidence for the preparation for death. That isn't the approval, certainly, for suicide. That isn't the approval or for simply giving up on life. That's not what God's saying. But what that is saying is that, and we're going to notice this later on, that Job is saying, look, I'm already headed in that direction. He feels like God is behind it. Just go ahead and take me now. I have suffered about all I can suffer. And if it's your plan that I'm going to be leaving this world shortly, just go ahead and allow that to happen. I'm ready to go. And we can understand that. Now, the wicked often seem to be in that situation more so than the righteous because they don't have hope. There's no hope for the righteous or for the wicked. What do they have to look forward to? What do they have to even make this life better? The wicked, they don't have things on which to lean. And so let's keep in mind, Job sees God as the force behind this suffering. Okay? He's not blaming God, but he is asking God to loosen his restraint and just go ahead and end his life. Now, here's something we need to consider when we're looking at these friends. Job had not lost his fear of the Almighty. He had not lost his reverential respect for the Almighty during any of this. But if he had, does that give his friends free rein to treat Job as they had been treating him? It doesn't, does it? They are still wrong for the way they had been treating Job. Let's notice Job's assessment of his friends. Even in his affliction, he rebukes them. They hadn't shown the proper kindness, especially at this time when he's being so tested. He says they were like our winter brook that promised water, refreshments, but they dry up when you need them most. He made the point that he said, I didn't ask for money from you. I didn't ask for financial assistance. He says, in fact, I didn't even ask you to come. I didn't ask for anything. But surely you could have given me spiritual and emotional help. And they didn't even ask, or they didn't even give any kind of help. Really. They were a source of nothing. All they did was try to ruin his name. They tried to run him into the ground. And they dealt with him deceitfully. They undermined his confidence. I don't know how he didn't, or how he wasn't just pushed over the edge with them. He continued that illustration of a winter stream, of promising needed water for the summer, but when you get there, the water's all dried up, and they would have known about that because the caravans from Tema are represented as arriving at those places as they traveled the desert, knowing where those water sources were. And when they get there, they fill their water skins, they get their water, and but when they get to those water sources, there's no water. then what do you do? You've already gone way out into the desert. They go from the Persian Gulf up to the Sea of Aqaba, and there's no water. Okay, that connected that area in North Arabia, and they looked for those streams. And so this exhibits the disappointment that Job had as he was looking for consolation from his friends, but he didn't have any consolation. They weren't giving him what he needed. They were nothing. They were nothing to Job. They saw his loss. They saw it materially. They saw it physically. But he didn't expect for them to provide for him in any of those ways. He just simply wanted a little emotional support, a little spiritual help. So he asked this rhetorical question. Did I ask you for anything? He hadn't asked for anything. And he demanded, he said, show me where I've erred. Show me where I've made a mistake. He made the statement, teach me. Show me. He said, I'll fix whatever I've done wrong. But I haven't done anything. So we see in verses 25 through 27 that Job would recognize a well-constructed argument. He would accept a well-constructed argument. But they haven't presented any good arguments for his sinfulness. All they could say is, well, you've done wrong, Job. You reap what you sow. God punishes the wicked. Well, show me in my life where I've been sinful. Well, as far as we can tell from the account, they came from far away. What did they know about Job's day-to-day life? They didn't know anything about Job. All they had heard was Job had suffered great loss. They were attacking a helpless friend. He asked them, he says, examine me, verses 28 through 30. Even a close inspection of the look on his face in his tribulation would know that he wasn't telling a lie. He was being sincere. And he said, consider the situation. Closely examine what's going on here. And they wrongly assessed it. You know, even during a time when there was no written revelation, they should have been able to discern that prosperity does not mean God's blessed you. Tribulation does not mean that God is punishing you. They should have known that. But they were way off base. And so he asked them to review your conclusions. At least they did continue to stay and listen. I guess we can give them that. But they were not paying attention to what Job was saying. Any comments, questions? Let's notice chapter 7. Job talks about the shortness of the days of a person's life. People are given a period of time to live in this world. Okay? 70, give or take. Some are much less, some are far greater. Okay? That is a general period of time that people come into this world and live, and Job said it's filled with labor and hardship. But that's not all it's filled with. Even Job had good days prior to this, and we learn after it's over, he had more good days to come. But in general, we live for a period of time, and mixed in that period of time, we have good days and we have bad days. We have hardships and we have days that are enjoyable. The writer of Hebrews warned, Hebrews 9:27, and as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment. But what was the point Job was making? Job was trying to vindicate himself for wanting his life to end, for God to take him. He wasn't going to kill himself. He wasn't going to do anything like that. He just simply wanted to go on because death was on the horizon. Okay, he said, well, a person lives a certain amount of time, whatever that amount of time is, and I'm asking God through all this tribulation just to go ahead and take me. He maintained that was natural to have those feelings. And he used some illustration. He says, soldiers desire for their terms of service to be up. He said the servant at the end of the day looks for a shady spot to sit. He said, what's wrong with that? He said, there's nothing wrong with wanting, once you have fulfilled your duty, to want that duty to end. He felt like he had fulfilled his duty. He described his discomfort as unending. At night he tossed and he turned, and he waited on the morning. When the night was over, hey, you know, at night it seems like your pain's worse. Well, you know, normal circumstances, I think maybe that's true. In the morning, your mind is on other things. You can get up, move around a little bit. Maybe you feel a little better. Not so for Job. In the morning, it was worse. When he went to bed, he looked for nighttime so he could rest. That next night, it was worse. The next morning, it was worse. The next night, it was worse. It just kept getting worse and worse. These boils produced open sores. Flies would lay eggs. He had worms. He would scrape the boils with a potsherd. You had maggots coming out of his sores. They would weep. That means his sores were leaking. The dust would come through in the air. It collected into the sores. It made clods on his skin. There were germs and airborne germs and things like that. It was just a mess. There was nothing he could do. Complete misery. He said his life was swift like a weaver's shuttle. Are you all familiar with a weaver's shuttle? You know what that is? Okay, let me show you what a weaver's shuttle is. It kind of makes it a little more interesting. A weaver's shuttle is, well, that looks kind of goofy, is a wooden, it's just a piece of wood that is used in weaving, and it has a hole in the middle, and in that hole is your thread, okay? The thread comes out the back, and as you're weaving, it's made different, but you have your thread, and you have, of course, a person would be holding it like this, but there would be two pieces of, two lines of thread. You'd have a whole lot of thread going this way, and beneath it, you'd have another bunch of thread going, and you would throw the shuttle back and forth in between it, and you'd pull, what's that called? I don't recall what this is called, but anyway, you would close the thread down. And as you close the thread down on each other, every time you pass the shuttle, you're making the fabric that way. But you toss that shuttle back and forth, and it's real fast. It's real fast making that cloth. Okay? That's the shuttle. But it's more pointed than that on the end. It can be real short. It can be real long. But anyway, the shuttle goes back and forth. And so that's what Job's talking about, a weaver's shuttle. And the lady's throwing it, or whoever. I mean, it's usually the lady, but the man can do it, throwing it back and forth with either hand, catching it. And you have to be pretty skilled to do it. You throw it and catch it, and you throw it, and every time it's thrown and caught, they pull the thread down, and it makes another line. She lets it up and throws it. Throws it. So it's really fast. But he's making the point that life's like a wind or a breath. It goes quickly. So he's making the point, it's already going fast, just let me go. Let me go. Okay? And I think we can get through this real quick. So he makes a strong complaint against God at this point. This is really where Job makes his mistake. Okay? This is a statement he later regretted because he didn't understand the greater context in verses 11 through 19. The idea here is Job stated his inability and distress at the thought of going through this and dying, and he just couldn't help but speak. But he asked God in this moment, and this is really where he makes his mistake. He said, am I like the sea or the whale? And he's going back to God creating all things and keeping the seas in check where they don't overflow, keeping the whale in check and confined. And he's asking God, in essence, he says, if you feel that I'm so rambunctious that I can't be trusted, that I have to be kept in check through all of these tribulations. Do you feel like I'm like that? So that's when he's making this defense toward God. That is where Job makes his mistake. Okay? He doesn't quite understand. And then he complained that he goes into his defense or his complaint about his health. But it's that one section right there where he really makes his mistake. Am I like the sea? Am I like the sea monster? That I have to be kept in check because I am misbehaving so bad, you have to use all of these terrible things to keep me in check. Okay? And then he talks about that he might go to bed, but he has these terrifying dreams. Or, and then kind of in this middle section, verses 17 and 18, that's very similar to Psalm 8. Okay? What is man that God would even consider man? What am I, God, that you're focusing on me? And we might add verse 19 in there. Why are you focusing on me and punishing me? He doesn't feel like he's being punished. This isn't something he's being punished for sin, but it's just the fact God is a sovereign God and He can do what He wants to. But why is it that you are focusing on me to bring this to me? And so that's what's similar to verse 18. Why are you looking at me? And then we get to the final verses here, 20 through 21. And Job's friend here, his friends, they erred by asserting again Job suffered because of his sinfulness. God had earlier affirmed, of course not to their knowledge, but God had affirmed Job was the kind of man that He wanted him to be. He was perfect and upright. He eschewed or turned away from evil. But being a man, he was subject to the weaknesses all people were subject to. So if he made a mistake, and he did, right there's where he made the mistake. Right there's where he made the mistake, I believe. Questioning God, am I like a troublemaker that you need to punish me to keep me in check? Or not really punish, but bring this upon me. But his confession of sin in verse 20 wasn't an admission of guilt, but what he's saying is, I acknowledge that I do have sin in my life, but that's why I offer sacrifice. I offer sacrifice. He's not saying that he lives in sin, right? He's not saying that he lives in sin. But if I have sinned, what should happen? Well, God ought to forgive me. He ought to forgive me because why? Well, I offer sacrifice. I live for God, right? I live for God. And in addition, he asks God here, why am I set up as a mark or a target for these attacks? That kind of goes back to verses 17 through 19. So, Job did speak rashly here, brethren, but let's keep in mind as we end here, we'll pick up verse 8 chapter 8 next time. Job did speak rashly, but let's keep in mind, listen, the man was desperate. He was desperate, and he did not have full understanding of the situation at this time. All right, thank you so much.